The deep woods were a place of shadows and whispers, a world away from the bustling, powerful packs Jax had always known. Here, the only sound was the crunch of his own worn boots on a carpet of fallen pine needles and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk. He was alone. Truly alone. The word they had used for him, the label that had sealed his fate, echoed in his mind with every step: Omega. It wasn't just a rank, it was a brand. It meant weak, unnecessary, a drain on resources. His own pack, the people he had called family, had looked at his gentle nature, his lack of aggressive alpha fire, and cast him out. The memory of their cold, dismissive faces was a sharper pain than the hunger gnawing at his stomach or the chill of the evening air seeping through his thin jacket. He had been walking for days, a sense of profound loneliness his only constant companion. The forest was vast and unforgiving, and as the sun began to dip below the treetops, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a new kind of fear set in. The night belonged to predators, and he was painfully aware that in the hierarchy of this wild place, he was now at the very bottom. He needed shelter, he needed food, but more than anything he needed a moment of peace from the relentless ache of rejection. It was by pure chance, or perhaps a twist of fate he couldn't yet understand, that the trees began to thin. He pushed through a final thicket of brambles, wincing as they snagged on his sleeves, and then he stopped dead in his tracks. The forest didn't just end, it opened up into a breathtaking vista. There, on a vast, manicured plateau, stood a castle. It wasn't the crumbling stone ruins from human stories. This was a stronghold of sleek, modern design blended with ancient, imposing strength. Towers of dark gray stone reached for the sky, and immense windows reflected the dying light of the sun. This was the seat of the most powerful werewolf in all the territories, a place spoken of in hushed, awe-filled tones. This was the home of Alpha King Soren. A normal wolf would have felt fear, a deep instinct to bow and retreat. But Jax, in his exhausted, hollow state, felt only a numb curiosity. The sheer scale of the place, its silent, majestic power, was so far removed from his own reality it almost didn't seem real. His feet, moving almost of their own accord, carried him closer, staying within the tree line, using the shadows as his cloak. He wasn't foolish enough to approach the grand front gates. Instead, he skirted the immense outer wall, looking for nothing more than a sheltered corner to rest his aching body for a few hours. His journey led him to the eastern side of the castle grounds, where the high wall was interrupted by ornate, wrought-iron gates. They were closed, but through the bars he could see a paradise. It was a garden, but unlike any he had ever seen. It was wild and cultivated all at once. Neat pathways wound through patches of untamed, fragrant lavender and rosemary, while elsewhere rows of vegetable patches stood in military straight lines. And in the center, a small, crystal-clear pond glittered with the last of the day's light. It was a place of quiet beauty, a stark contrast to the castle's imposing front. It was then that he saw them. Two figures. His breath hitched in his throat, and he melted back against a large oak tree, his heart hammering against his ribs. One was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, emanating an aura of authority so potent it was almost a physical force even from this distance. He had dark hair and a stern, handsome face etched with a sadness so deep it seemed a permanent part of his features. This could be no one else but the Alpha King himself, Soren. The king was not looking out at his domain. His entire attention was focused on the small figure beside him. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, with hair the color of moonlight. She was sitting on the grass, utterly still, her small fingers tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. She did not look up at her father. She did not speak. She simply existed in a world of her own silent making. The king knelt beside her, his mouth moving as he spoke words Jax could not hear. He reached out a hand, large and capable, and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. The gesture was so tender it made Jax's chest hurt. The girl did not react. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean into the touch either. It was as if she was a beautiful, silent statue. The look on the king's face then was one of such raw, helpless heartbreak that Jax had to look away. He saw the king's shoulders slump, a king brought low not by war or challenge, but by the silent grief of his child. After a long moment, the king stood, his expression closing off into its usual mask of stern authority, though the sadness still lingered in his eyes. He turned and walked back towards the castle, leaving the little girl alone in the twilight. Jax should have left then. His presence was a trespass of the highest order. But he couldn't tear his eyes away from the small, solitary figure in the garden. She looked so alone. It was a loneliness he understood intimately in that moment. The kind that existed even when you were surrounded by walls and people in power. Her silence felt like a mirror to his own feeling of being unheard and unseen. His stomach chose that moment to growl loudly, a painful cramp of emptiness reminding him of his own desperate circumstances. His eyes scanned the garden and landed on a berry bush nestled near the wall, heavy with ripe, dark fruit. It was on his side of the fence. It was a risk, a foolish one, but hunger overpowered fear. Crouching low, he moved silently along the tree line until he was parallel with the bush. He glanced at the girl. She hadn't moved. With trembling fingers he began to pluck the berries, stuffing them into his mouth. They were sweet and tangy, the best thing he had ever tasted. He was so focused on the simple act of eating that he didn't notice the subtle shift in the air. When he finally looked up, his heart leaped into his throat. The little girl was no longer looking at the ground. She was standing now, just on the other side of the iron gate, her wide, curious eyes fixed directly on him. She didn't look scared. She just looked interested. Jax froze, a berry halfway to his mouth, expecting her to turn and run, to scream for the guards. But she didn't. She took one small step closer to the gate, her silent gaze unwavering. Jax slowly lowered his hand. He knew he should run, vanish back into the forest before he was discovered. But the look in her eyes wasn't one of accusation or fear. It was simple, pure curiosity. And something else, a shared understanding of solitude. Very slowly, making no sudden movements, Jax sat down, leaning his back against the rough bark of the tree. He kept a safe, respectful distance from the gate. He didn't speak to her. What could he possibly say to the silent daughter of an alpha king? Instead, he did the only thing that felt natural. He began to talk, his voice a soft, low murmur meant for no one but the evening air and perhaps one silent little girl. "He's a bold one, that squirrel over there," he said, nodding towards a tree where a bushy-tailed creature was chattering. "Thinks he owns the whole forest. I tried to tell him I was just passing through, but he didn't seem to believe me." He kept his tone light, conversational, as if he was talking to an old friend. He told her about a rabbit he'd seen earlier with a funny hop, and about how the ladybugs were starting to find their spots for the night. He spoke of simple, gentle things, his words painting quiet pictures in the growing dusk. He didn't ask her questions. He didn't expect a reply. He just offered the gift of his voice, a soft noise to fill the silent space between them. And from the deep shadows of a balcony high above the garden, hidden by a curtain of thick ivy, Alpha King Soren stood, watching. He had sensed the faint, unfamiliar omega scent on the air the moment he'd stepped inside and had returned to investigate, his protective instincts on high alert. He had expected an intruder, a threat. He was poised to descend, to defend, to eliminate. But the scene that unfolded below him was not one of danger. It was one of profound and quiet strangeness. He saw the ragged young man, clearly an outcast from his worn clothes and thin frame. He saw him eating the berries from the bush, a clear act of desperation. And he saw his daughter, his Elara, who shied away from every new guard, every visiting dignitary, standing transfixed by this stranger. He saw the man sit, keeping his distance, and then he heard him begin to speak. Not to her but for her. The king listened to the soft, rambling stories about squirrels and ladybugs. He saw the way the man never once pressured Elara to respond, never once invaded her space. He simply offered his presence. And then the impossible happened. As the young man told a particularly silly story about a frog who was afraid of the water, Soren saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible change in his daughter's face. The corners of her mouth, which had been set in a solemn, straight line for so long, twitched. It wasn't a smile, not quite. But it was a movement. A reaction. A jolt, like a lightning strike, went through the Alpha King. His hand, which had been clenched into a fist ready for a fight, slowly uncurled. The harsh lines of his face softened, just for a moment as he watched this unexpected scene. A single traitorous tear, born of a hope he had long since buried, welled in his eye. He fought it back, swallowing hard against the sudden, painful lump in his throat. He did not reveal himself. He did not interrupt. For the first time in a year, someone had managed to touch the world where his daughter was trapped. And so, the most powerful wolf in the land remained hidden in the shadows, silently watching, listening, and fighting a battle against the tears he would never let anyone else see. The garden, once merely a beautiful space, had become a secret stage for a silent play. Each day, as the sun began its slow descent, Jax would emerge from the forest edge, his movements cautious but his purpose now clear. The gnawing hunger that had first driven him to the berry bush was still there, a constant, dull ache, but it was overshadowed by a new, unfamiliar need, the need to see if the silent little girl would be there. The memory of her faint, almost smile was a tiny, warm ember in the cold emptiness of his exile. He was playing a dangerous game. He knew the stories of Alpha King Soren, a ruler known for his fierce protection of his territory and his unmatched stoic strength. Discovery meant, at best, a brutal ejection from the lands. At worst, it meant something Jax didn't dare let his mind fully consider. Yet the pull was too strong. The girl's silence was a language he felt he could somehow understand, a quiet echo of his own feeling of being utterly disregarded by the world. He began to bring offerings, small treasures from the forest that cost nothing but a moment of notice. A feather from a blue jay, iridescent and perfect. A smooth, gray stone veined with white that felt cool and comforting in the palm. He would place these items carefully on his side of the iron gate, not pushing them through, not imposing, simply leaving them there for her to see. He would then resume his seat against his tree, the familiar oak that felt like his only ally, and he would talk. His stories evolved. They were no longer just about the animals he saw. He began to weave tales of a brave little badger who was smaller than all the others but used his cleverness to find the best food, stories of a family of mice who built a magnificent home in the roots of a great tree, safe and warm and loved. He spoke of the wind not as a cold force, but as a messenger carrying secrets from one part of the forest to another. His voice remained a soft, steady hum, a gentle soundtrack to the fading daylight. He never asked for anything. He never expected a response. He simply gave her his words, a quiet gift from one lonely soul to another. Elara, in her silent world, began to anticipate these visits. Her nanny would note that in the late afternoons, the child would become restless, her eyes drifting toward the garden door. She would lead the way outside, not to her usual spot in the very center, but to a place near the iron gate where she could sit and wait. Her eyes, once dull and distant, now held a watchful light. She would watch for his arrival, and when he came she would study him with an intense, solemn focus, her small hands often clutching the latest forest gift he had left. High above, the silent audience of one never missed a performance. Alpha King Soren's balcony became his nightly vigil. The weight of his crown, the pressures of his throne, the endless petitions and disputes of the pack, all of it faded into a dull background noise as he took his hidden position. His sharp alpha senses allowed him to hear every word, see every subtle exchange. He watched the way Jax always maintained a respectful distance, the way his body language was never threatening, always open and calm. Soren saw the changes in his daughter. The faint light in her eyes, the slight tilt of her head as she listened, the way she would sometimes shift her position to get a better view of Jax's expressive hands as he told his stories. He was a king who commanded armies and settled monumental disputes, yet he was utterly powerless to elicit this reaction from his own child. This stranger, this rejected Omega, was accomplishing what all the power in the world could not. It was a humbling, painful, and awe-inspiring thing to witness. One afternoon, a light rain began to fall, a soft drizzle that pattered on the leaves and made the world smell of wet earth. Jax, seated under his tree which offered meager shelter, shivered slightly but made no move to leave. Elara, from her side of the gate, watched the rain dampen his hair and clothes. In a movement so small it was almost nothing, she shifted the small wool blanket she had brought with her from her shoulders, holding it out slightly in his direction for a moment before pulling it back, a silent, impossible offer of warmth across the divide. The gesture was not lost on Jax, whose gentle narration faltered for a second, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. It was certainly not lost on Soren, who from his balcony felt his breath catch in his chest. His little girl was not just receiving kindness, she was trying to offer it back. The days blended into a fragile routine. Jax, emboldened by this unspoken connection, one day felt a deeper sadness weighing on him. The memory of his rejection, usually buried under the need to survive, surfaced with a sharp pain. He kept his voice soft but the tone changed, becoming more personal, more raw. "You know," he said, not looking at Elara but at a leaf he was turning over in his hands, "my old pack, they thought I wasn't strong enough. They have a lot of rules about what strong is supposed to look like. They told me to leave." He took a shaky breath. "It hurts being told you don't belong anywhere, that you're not good enough just as you are. It makes you want to be very quiet, to just disappear inside yourself. I think I understand that." He wasn't preaching. He wasn't even sure he was talking to her. He was simply speaking a painful truth into the space between them. He glanced up then. Elara was watching him, her head tilted. Her expression was unreadable, but she was listening, absorbing every word. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached a small hand through the bars of the gate. It wasn't a wave or a demand. It was simply an offering. A connection. Jax's heart hammered. He looked at her small, pale hand, then slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached out his own. He didn't take her hand. He simply placed his fingertip against the pad of her own for the briefest of moments, a tiny point of contact between two worlds. A tear escaped his eye and traced a clean path through the light grime on his cheek. He pulled his hand back, giving her a watery smile. "Thank you," he whispered. The following day was sunny and bright. Jax, feeling a strange sense of lightness, decided to try something new. He plucked a wide, sturdy blade of grass. "My dad taught me this," he said, a fond, distant look in his eyes. "A long time ago." He placed the grass between his thumbs and blew. The attempt was a spectacular failure, producing nothing but a faint, sputtering raspberry sound. He laughed at himself, a genuine warm sound that seemed to startle the quiet of the garden. "See? Not very good at it." He was much better. He tried again with the same silly, sputtering result. And that's when it happened. From the other side of the gate came a sound. It was tiny, barely a whisper of air. It was a soft, breathy little exhale that carried a note of amusement. A giggle. It wasn't a word. It held no meaning. But it was a sound. A voluntary, emotional sound. In the tree, Jax froze, his eyes widening in disbelief, the blade of grass falling forgotten from his fingers. And on the balcony high above, Alpha King Soren, who had heard every failed attempt and seen his daughter's attentive face, suddenly gripped the stone railing so hard his knuckles turned white. That tiny, breathy giggle, a sound he had feared he would never hear again, hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was the most beautiful, heartbreaking sound in the world. A wave of emotion, so powerful it was dizzying, crashed over him. A tidal wave of relief, of joy, of gratitude, and of a profound, shattering grief for all the silent time that had passed. He brought a hand to his mouth, his shoulders shaking. A sob, raw and ragged, tried to escape his throat, and he fought it with every ounce of his will, clamping his jaw shut until it ached. The tears he could not stop, however. They streamed down his face freely, dripping onto the cold stone of the balcony floor. The mighty Alpha King, hidden in the shadows, wept in silent, overwhelming gratitude for a gift given by the unlikeliest of souls. The evening after the giggle, the air in the garden felt different. It was charged with a fragile, hopeful energy, as if the very leaves on the trees were holding their breath. Jax had replayed the sound in his mind 1,000 times, a precious secret he carried with him back into the cold loneliness of the forest. It was a sound that had rewired something inside him, making the ache of his exile feel a little less sharp. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would go back. He had to. Not for the berries, not for shelter, but for her. For the silent little girl who had found a way to speak without words. The next day he approached the garden with a new kind of reverence. The fear of being caught was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a powerful sense of purpose. He had a mission now, one that felt more important than any pack duty he'd ever failed. Today he carried a small, carefully woven crown made of clover flowers and delicate vines, a tiny, foolish offering for a princess who lived in a castle. He reached his familiar spot under the oak tree. The sky was a clear, pale blue, and the sun was warm on his skin. He looked toward the gate, expecting to see Elara waiting. But the garden on the other side was empty. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, washed over him. Had it all been a dream? Had the king discovered their meetings and forbidden her from coming? Had he, in his foolishness, ruined the one good thing he'd found? His heart sank, a heavy stone in his chest. The clover crown felt silly and pathetic in his hand. He had overstayed his welcome in this fantasy. It was time to go, to vanish back into the trees before guards were sent to hunt the trespassing Omega. The thought was a physical pain. He took one last long look at the empty garden, memorizing the spot where she used to sit, and turned to leave. Wait. The voice was not a shout. It was not a command from a guard. It was a single quiet word, spoken in a voice soft from disuse, yet clear as a bell in the still afternoon air. Jax froze, his back still turned. He must have imagined it. He was so desperate to hear something that his mind was playing tricks on him. He slowly, ever so slowly, turned around. There she was. Elara was standing just outside the garden gate, which was now slightly ajar. She was not alone. Behind her, tall and imposing, his presence seeming to fill the entire clearing, stood Alpha King Soren. The king's face was an unreadable mask, but his eyes, those deep, sorrowful eyes, were fixed intently on Jax. Jax's blood ran cold. This was it. This was the end. His instincts screamed at him to submit, to drop to his knees and bare his throat in surrender. His body trembled, but he forced himself to stand his ground, to meet the king's gaze, ready to accept his fate for the crime of bringing a moment of joy to a lonely child. The king took a step forward. Jax flinched, bracing himself. But the king did not roar. He did not attack. He simply looked from Jax's terrified face down to the small woven clover crown still clutched in his hand. Then his gaze shifted to his daughter, who was looking up at him with a silent, powerful plea in her eyes. When the king spoke, his voice was low. It was not the thunderous boom of an alpha pronouncing judgment. It was hushed, layered with a complexity of emotions Jax could barely comprehend. It was the voice of a father, not a king. "I have been watching you," Soren said, the words simple, stark and undeniable. Jax's breath hitched. He had known on some level that their secret was too beautiful to last, but having it confirmed sent a fresh wave of terror through him. "My king, I can explain. I meant no harm, I only—" Soren raised a hand, not in anger but to stop the frantic apologies. "I know what you meant," he interrupted, his voice still quiet, still measured. "I have seen what you did." He paused, and the mask of the stern ruler seemed to crack, just for a second. A profound vulnerability shone through. "You spoke to her. Not at her. You saw her. Not through her." His eyes glistened with unshed tears. He would no longer fight. "You gave her a space where her silence was not a problem to be solved." He took another step closer, and Jax could see the raw, honest gratitude on the man's face. It was the last thing he ever expected to see. "You gave her back a piece of herself," Soren continued, his voice thickening. "And in doing so, you have given me a gift I can never repay. You have given me hope." The words hung in the air, so immense and powerful they seemed to change the very atmosphere. Jax stood utterly still, stunned into silence, the clover crown dangling forgotten from his fingers. It was then that Elara moved. She walked the few steps that separated her from Jax. She looked up at his stunned, tear-streaked face, then at the flower crown in his hand. She reached out one small, pale hand and pointed to it, then to her own head. A silent request. With trembling hands, Jax knelt before her, bringing himself to her level. He was acutely aware of the Alpha King's watchful gaze, but all his attention was on the girl. Slowly, with a reverence usually reserved for sacred objects, he placed the simple clover crown upon her head of silver hair. It was a ridiculous, humble thing against the backdrop of her fine dress and her royal life, but she treated it as if it were made of diamonds. A real, true, unmistakable smile broke across her face, so bright it seemed to light up the whole forest. She looked from Jax to her father and back again. She took a deep, steadying breath, the way someone might before jumping into a deep pool. And then she spoke. Her voice was clear, a little rusty, but filled with a determination that belied her small size. "Stay." That one word, that single, powerful syllable, shattered the last of Jax's defenses. A sob broke from him and he bowed his head, tears streaming down his face onto the forest floor. He had spent his entire life being told he was not enough, that he didn't belong. And now, the most powerful being in the world and his miraculous daughter were asking him to. King Soren closed the distance between them. He too knelt, a king kneeling in the dirt before an Omega, and placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. He looked at Jax, his own eyes shining. "She is right," he said, his voice firm now, but with a warmth that seemed to wrap around Jax like a blanket. "The offer I am about to make is not one I make lightly. Please, stay. Not as a trespasser. Not as an Omega. But as her friend. As part of this family. You have a home here if you want it." The words washed over Jax, healing wounds he thought would never close. A home. A family. Belonging. They were concepts that had become fairy tales to him. He looked at Elara's hopeful, smiling face, the clover crown perched proudly on her head. He looked at the Alpha King who was watching him not with pity, but with respect and a genuine, open-hearted offer. He didn't have the words to express what was in his heart. The gratitude was too big, the relief too overwhelming. So he simply nodded, a tearful, joyful smile breaking through his tears. "Yes," he managed to whisper, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Yes." King Soren stood, offering a hand not to command, but to help Jax to his feet. Elara immediately reached up and slipped her small hand into Jax's, holding on tightly. Together, the three of them, the rejected Omega, the silent princess who found her voice, and the Alpha King who learned a new kind of strength, turned and walked away from the old oak tree and the iron gate. They walked away from the shadows and toward the open doors of the castle, not as a king and his subjects, but as something new. Something built not on power or rank, but on kindness, on understanding, and on the simple, profound power of a gentle heart that had finally found its place to call home. And if you've been moved by the journey of Jax, Elara, and King Soren, if you felt the warmth of a found family and the power of a kindness that changes destinies, then our channel is a place for you. We weave tales of love that breaks down barriers, of strength found in softness, and of hearts that find their home where they least expect it. Subscribe to stay with us for the next story, the next adventure, the next moment of magic waiting just for you.